U.S. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump, they've both won the Michigan primaries.
A message, it's an important message that we won't stand by idly while horrors happen on our behalf on the other side of the world.
Biden finished first, but uncommitted was second, as many Arab groups in the state advocated against voting for Biden over America's stance on the war in Gaza. The victories further solidify what will likely be a rematch in November's presidential election. And for analysis, we're now joined live by Michael K. Fauntleroy, Associate Professor of Policy and Government and the founding director of the Race, Politics and Policy Center at George Mason University. It's good to see you, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us. The uncommitted vote in Michigan's Democratic primary tells a really interesting story. Arab Americans, specifically Arabs in Dearborn, have been warning Biden about their anger over his handling of the Israel-Hamas war. What do you think the Democrats are taking from last night's results?
Well, I think they're taking what initially would be a very clear and obvious message and hoping that they can figure out a way to contain it in Michigan and keep it from spreading to other battleground states like Minnesota, for example, which votes pretty soon, too. Now, having said all that, this is a message that the Biden administration has received some time ago, and they're being, at some level, penalized because they can't necessarily can't control what goes on in the Middle East. The Biden administration has been nudged and pushed and cajoled into calling for a ceasefire, which, by the way, is partly why you heard President Biden on Monday indicate that there might be something in the offing. But as it stands right now, this is a potentially disastrous political firestorm that he's facing, but one that, at least at this point, can still be resolved because there's a fundamental question that the uncommitted supporters have to answer, and that is, what's the plan for November? Because if they push too hard on Biden, they could potentially open the door for Trump. And based on history, Trump's history, that is, he would be far worse for Gaza than President Biden.
Okay, Professor Fauntleroy, going off that, let's talk about Trump's vulnerabilities. Tens of thousands of people in Michigan, they voted against him. So what did that tell you? President
Trump really does have a high hill to climb. I know there's some polling that shows that he's in the lead in some cases in a hypothetical matchup with President Biden, or very close. But it's important for everybody to remember that he lost the general election by close to 7 million votes. And it doesn't appear that he's done very much to find those votes anywhere. Now, we do it state by state, and in some states the election was much closer. But the reality is that it doesn't seem, at least at this point, in those battleground states that he lost, with the possible exception of Georgia, that he's closed the gap in any meaningful way. So in terms of vulnerabilities, the main one is that, at least at this point, he has not been able to convince people that he is better than Biden.
Michael, Nikki Haley and others have raised concerns about the age of both Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And all eyes on this. Biden is having his annual physical today, and those results are going to be watched very closely because he's got to convince voters in America that he is fit to run for office.
So Lena, here's a real conundrum, right? So I teach a course on the American presidency every Tuesday and Thursday morning. My students are 18 to 22, 18 to 23, and they're simply mortified by the age of American leaders, be it President Biden, former President Trump, Congress, leaders in Congress, and so on and so forth. So for some Americans, there's nothing that can come out of that physical tomorrow that's going to make anybody feel any better about him. But the really important point I think everybody needs to keep in mind is it's not just the number of someone's age, it's their ideas, their vitality, and if he can continue to get out and show people and maybe calm fears, he'll be all right. In part because his opponent, his likely opponent, Donald Trump, is 77 years old, not much younger or not much different in age than President Biden. It's a real sticky thing. There's no clear and great answers on this. The numbers are what they are, but he has to own it, sort of lean into it, and do his best with it.
Okay, and Professor Fauntleroy, I want to ask you this. We are just getting reports that Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell is going to be stepping down in November. Can you talk about this and what what effect this may have on the upcoming election.
It's not a big surprise. You know, as I just said a moment ago, we have some really old leaders in the United States, and Mitch McConnell is right up there with all of them. He's been under a great deal of fire for his leadership in recent years, in part because the Republican Party has shifted so much to the right, much more extreme, much less willing to compromise and work in a bipartisan fashion. And so while Senator McConnell is very transactional in his politics and very much into using whatever power he has at his disposal, he also understands that given all that's going on around him and the misgivings that some people have and the health scares that he's had earlier this year and last year, that now is as good a time as any. So now we see the other members in the Senate now openly jockeying for a position to succeed him.
All right, getting some reaction to the breaking news here. Michael K. Fontroy, always a pleasure to get your thoughts. Thank you for joining us.